Hello, everyone. This is your host, Isma Shafique from the heart of Silicon Valley. And you are listening to the Isma Shafique Podcast, where you hear from the brilliant minds shaping the future of AI, technology, and business, the ones defining what comes next. So, my today's guest is Josh Haas. He is the founder and co-CEO of Bubble.io. Bubble is the leading AI visual development platform that lets people with no coding experience to create web pages and mobile applications. Before founding Bubble, Josh was the co-founder of Keyword Smart. He worked at Bridgewater Associates and was a philosophy major at Harvard. Josh, I am so happy to have you.
Yeah, it's good to be on the show. I'm excited to dive into our conversation.
All right, let's start a little bit of your early background. Let's go all the way back before companies, before careers, before Harvard. What was the kind of questions that fascinated you as a kid? Can we take a quick peek into your young version of you?
Yeah, so I've always actually been pretty interested in technology. And as a kid, I remember having like this very tangible appreciation of it. Like, I remember fantasizing about like building a computer out of paper. This was like before I really understood how computers worked. I was just sort of imagining like little gears and paper pieces. And then my best friend in first grade basically recruited me as his best friend by offering to build a time machine with me. And he had a lot of electronics, so we tried to like put the electronics together to make a time machine. So I always really like enjoyed building things, getting hands-on, technology. Yeah, it's kind of where the kind of kid I was.
That's very interesting. And then I have a follow-up question. How much of who you've become is intentional and how much is just a momentum?
Yeah, that is a great question. It's a hardball. That's a mean question. A lot of people would,
Yeah.
have a hard time answering that. I think it's a mix, to be honest, right? Like, I have definitely let momentum carry me at various parts of my life, but I think there's been a few true norths that I've kind of like steered towards. Some of that's technology related. Some of that is about sort of understanding the world and understanding it with like an eye to like making a positive impact and improving the world. And I think that's sort of guided me along the way. And then sort of trusting my instincts and curiosity. So I would say I certainly did not plan to become a CEO of a tech company. Like that was an accident, but I think there's been things in my life that have like sort of guided the path a little bit, if that makes sense.
I looked at your bio and you studied and majored philosophy at Harvard. That's
Mhm.
impressive. Before building one of the most important developer platform of this era, what questions about life were you trying to answer back then? And are you still trying to answer?
I mean, I became a philosophy major just out of like curiosity. It seemed like the most fundamental discipline, like really asking why, right? And that was the part of philosophy that I was always most interested in. Why should you do anything? What's important? What's, in philosophical terms, what's like ethical? What's moral? What's right? Where do is and ought come from? The term for that is like normativity, right? Like where do things get their like force to compel you? And I'm still pretty interested in that question, but my attitude on it has shifted. Back in college, I kind of viewed it as like an intellectual endeavor, right? Where you kind of like solve this riddle by thinking really, really hard about it. And I think I sort of hit the limits of intellect. I don't think there is an intellectual answer to those questions. I think, why, the answer is because, right? And now I still care a lot about it, but I view it as more of an experiential thing where I try and align myself with um sort of my best instincts and try and like have an integrity in it, like how I act and think. And then what I find is when I'm successful in doing that, I just sort of spontaneously know what I want or what I value or what I care about without having to fall back on sort of like an intellectual justification or reason.
Do you think that philosophical lens is what makes you the right person to build this kind of technology? And because you're not just solving for the technology, you are solving for human agency. What is your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm like uniquely qualified or anything, but what I will say is the philosophy background is relevant in my opinion. Like, I think being a successful entrepreneur and building something that has lasting impact is not so much about your ability to execute as much as it is your ability to ask the right questions and care about the right things, right? And I think the fact that I've been sort of thinking about like what is the good, right? Like to go back to like Plato, right? Led me down chains of thought that fed into my vision for Bubble, and I don't think I would have built the same company without that philosophy background.
It really reminds me recently when Chat GPT went from GPT 4.0 to 5.0, and
Mhm,
there was a big backlash and outcry from the public because people were what we they were really essentially missing was the empathy part. So
mhm,
empathy is really important. I think nowadays capability is not really what's missing; it's the empathy.
mhm.
So you having that philosophy background is definitely going to bring some empathy, and that will be ingrained in whatever you're building now and what we'll see in the future. So that's a good combination.
Yeah, I 100% agree on empathy. Not necessarily that philosophy always leads to empathy,
Right, right, right,
but
right.
I do think really thinking about the human aspect of
Right.
technology, and as the world gets more and more AI put into it, that human element and caring. I almost like the word caring more than I like the word empathy, because caring is sort of like grounding in like why this matters. This does matter, a sense of like commitment. Where empathy is like, oh, I understand you. I have
Yeah.
plenty of empathy,
Right.
right? But
Right.
that sense of caring, I think, is what differentiates great tech from sort of bled destructive tech.
Absolutely. Building technology is no longer just technical, it's deeply human.
Yeah.
So I completely with you on that. So thank you so much. My next question is more, I'll switch a little bit of gears
Mhm.
and I want to talk about something that's really a hot topic nowadays, and especially with so many layoffs going on. If you've been following the news, all that brings fear in people's mind. A lot of people feel really anxious about AI replacing them. How much of that fear is, in your opinion, is valid, and how much of it is just misplaced?
Yeah. So I've heard two separate tracks from leaders as I think about AI. One track, there are absolutely executives out there who are looking at it and looking at their bottom line and seeing a cost reduction opportunity, right? And we've seen that on the news. It happens. I think some of those layoffs, frankly, are they're using AI as an excuse to do layoffs they already wanted to do. But there's definitely, I mean, I've heard talks from people bragging about like what percent of the workload can be eliminated by AI. So that's one track. The other track is people who see AI as a force multiplier, right? Like it's not about replacing humans, it's about taking the best in a human, allowing them to have 10 times the impact they otherwise would have. And I think which track you fall into as a leader comes down to how you see your team and how you see your business, right? Like if you're in sort of this scarcity mindset, extractive, make as much, squeeze as much money out of like a small pie mindset as possible, then AI is just another way to cut costs. And, I think if I'm sure everyone out there listening to this knows their leaders and knows their company and kind of knows what's in the back of their leaders' minds. And if I think if your leader is like that, then I think there is some grounding to fear and concern that they might try and use AI that way. The way I see it, Bubble has always had 100 times more work than we've had people to do it. And if we got through that work, we'd have 1,000 times more work because we'd have 1,000 times more customers, right? So to me, I view the ability to force multiply a person as generative of value, generative of more work, generative of more opportunity. And I think the thing that excites me about AI is not the bottom line, it's the top line, right? It's the ability to, create more value and bring it into the world. So I think AI will lead to, some companies shrinking their headcount, some companies growing their headcount, and that's disruptive and hard to live through. So the anxiety is totally warranted, right? But I think there's a silver lining, and I think if you're conscious about like how you're navigating the workforce, you can steer yourself towards companies that are likely to expand because they view it as a value add, not as a cost saving measure.
Agree. Yeah, some of that fear is definitely valid. And yeah, thank you so much for giving some excitement to the people. So those who are watching, please follow the career page at bubble.com website.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
more to come.
we are hiring. Thank you
Yeah,
for the little pitch. Yeah.
got it. All right. Do you think AI is more of a technological revolution or psychological one or both?
That's an interesting question, right? I mean, I think all the really big technologies are both, and they start technological and become psychological. Like if you look at the car, right? Like first it was a new technology, then it reshaped the like urban and suburban. It basically created suburbia, and suburbia created a whole new way of being and thinking. And look at iPhones or social media, right? Like both of those technologies started by like enabling things, but then culture changed around them. It became a psychological thing. So I think AI is going to be the same. And I think right now we're in the technological phase of it, right? We're still figuring out what can this do. It keeps on changing. The technology has not plateaued yet. It's still getting better, right?
It's
So
evolving.
it's evolving in real time.
Mhm.
So I think there will be psychological transformation. It's hard to imagine a technology with as much impact as AI not leading to some kind of transformation, right? But I think we're not in that phase yet, is my read.
If AI keeps getting better, what becomes uniquely human that actually matters?
Yeah. So there's sort of like an implicit thought there, right? Which is that like as AI gets better, it starts taking things away from our humanness, right? I think it falls into a couple categories, right? Like one thing, right, is a sense of purpose and contribution, right? Because if AI can do a job better than a person can, and that's a lot of the fear right now. Can it code better than the coders? Can it write better than the writers? Can it do art better than the artists, right? Like if it takes away the ability to be economically useful, right, that cuts at something really, really deep.
But I know it's going to be a co-pilot,
Hmm.
AI with the human, so human with the machine together
Hmm.
can do wonders.
I mean, I want to be frank, right? Like I do think some economic value is going to shift, and there is going to be things that were uniquely human that aren't. Like, I'm watching programming very closely right now. Like that's my industry, that's my background, right? And I think there's still a lot of value for humans in software creation, but I think that value is very quickly moving away from being the person who types the code.
Mm.
To your original question, like what's left, right? Like being useful. I mean, let's take the extreme scenario. I think this question gets interesting in the limit. Like, let's say AI gets 1,000 times better, and it's able to run the whole economy, right? Like, that's the most extreme vision of where this thing could go. In a world where AI has basically, doesn't need humans anymore for economic contribution, does that mean humans lives don't have meaning? I'm not sure it does, right? Like I think meaning comes from our relationships to each other. It comes from our ability to like engage with and appreciate the world. And I think activities like like art, right? Like someone who's like a real artist isn't going to stop painting because there's someone else in the world out there who's a better painter than them, right? Like I don't think AI might make it so that you can't that art isn't economically important. Like, it could take that away, but I don't think it can take like the meaning element of it away. Even in like the extreme case where AI does get better than any human painter, which, by the way, I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But that's some of the discourse around this right now.
If intelligence is no longer rare, what makes a human life meaningful?
So on that meaning question, right? So I'll share like a little bit of personal background here, right?
Mhm.
Like, I was kind of a teacher's pet growing up. Like, I always got A's. I valued school. I valued being good at school. I valued being the smartest person in the room. I liked to raise my hand and have the right answer. And I sort of got stuck in this like virtuous feedback loop where because I liked doing it, I got better at it. Because I got better at it, I got more praise for it. Because I got more
Yeah.
praise for it, I was more confident. And sort of like and then I sort of grew up and crashed into reality a little bit, right? It turns out I'm not always the smartest person in the room. It turns out that
Yeah.
intelligence doesn't solve all problems, right?
Right.
So it was like being smart was actually pretty core to my identity for a big chunk of my life. And it was pretty painful to like have to shed that because I just got feedback from the universe that like that's not the right way to define myself. But it's so much better on the other side. Like, since I've like been able to like kind of sort of let that leave my sense of identity, I'm much more relaxed, I'm much happier, and it's much easier to derive meaning and pleasure. So I don't think AI being smarter than me, at least, would take anything away from my sense of meaning because I've already experienced other people being smarter than me. I've already experienced smart hitting hard walls, right? So that's kind of how I process that question personally. I think everyone is going to have to answer that for themselves, right?
Right. Now I'll switch a little bit gears towards the power shift. For the first time in history, anyone can build software. Who gains power in that world, and who quietly loses it?
I love this question. This is very much what Bubble is about. We're sitting here in San Francisco. I would love to shift the center of momentum a little bit away from San Francisco and towards the rest of the world.
Sure.
And pretty simply, right? Like, San Francisco just isn't representative of the whole world. And I think it's an amazing city and amazing culture. And there's a lot of really cool stuff here. But I don't want the future to be entirely shaped by the people on this little peninsula. And I think that moving creation abilities more generally, making it easier for people to create, I think creates an economic dynamic where someone outside of the normal tech circle, someone who's just, an ordinary person who is close to a problem, right? The kind of problem that like affects their community or their, world, um, can then execute against that problem and create something really valuable. So I love decentralizing technologies. I think the ability to use AI to create software is a very decentralizing technology. I am a little worried that in an AI powered world, the model providers might gain power back, right? Because I mean, there's so much flowing through them. But it gives me some comfort to see there a fair amount of competition in that space, right? Like Anthropic and OpenAI are the big players, but there's a lot of people getting in. There's, Chinese companies, there's Google, even I don't love Meta doing this necessarily, but at least they're another contender in the game and trying to release models, right? So I'm hoping that at the end of the day, and I don't know if this is how it's going to play out, but I'm hoping that the AI becomes the commodity and the power lands in the hands of the creators.
Got it. And there will be winners and losers once the dust settles down a bit more. If we say that we are redefining intelligence, if AI can now write the code better than most engineers, what does being smart actually mean in 2026?
Yeah, so I think intelligence is going to evolve from like book smart to street smart is like the one
Yeah.
way of putting it, right? Um, in an engineering context, right? Like what I'm seeing every day becoming more valuable is the ability to ask the right questions, the ability to know what's important, the ability to go meta a little bit and step back and say like, all right, well, we could steer this AI however we want, but like, how should we steer it? What's working, what's not working? So I think it shifts very much in the direction of intelligence as
Yeah, we need more
yeah,
EQ than the IQ.
exactly, more EQ than IQ. That's a very good
Yep.
way of putting it.
I remember a little bit of my earlier discussion with you, and you did touch a point, which is creators versus consumers of the technology. What does that actually look like for a 25-year-old who doesn't even know where to start?
I mean, I started Bubble when I was 26, so I don't count the 25-year-olds out
Yeah.
is my attitude. But the way you become a creator of technology rather than just a consumer of technology is by noticing a problem and having the hypothesis that maybe the problem is solvable, right? Like every day there's things that like frustrate me personally and frustrate my friends and frustrate me about the world around me, and most of the time I take them for granted. I just kind of assume like that's how it is, that's the system, right? And I think the magic happens when someone, a 25-year-old, wakes up and says like, hey, actually, what if I could solve it? Right. And that is asking that question starts the process. I mean, personally, I got the idea for Bubble when I was like sort of, frustrated by the fact that non-programmers couldn't build technology because I had, a bunch of interactions with people who were like struggling with this and I cared about them and I want to unblock them. And the thought occurred to me like, well, what if they could? Right. And as soon as I asked that question, the idea for Bubble popped into my head. And I think that's kind of like the entrepreneurial move at the end of the day, like that ability to like take something that is taken for granted and challenge it. And where technology comes in is it can enable people to have that thought, like enable people to think that like, oh, maybe it is changeable. Maybe it isn't something that's fixed. And I think that's also why, role models are really important. Like people who, sort of demonstrate like, hey, here's a hard problem. I'm going to go after it.
Mhm. And yeah, and all the credit goes to the AI and generative AI. Those barriers to build, barriers to entry are pretty much removed for everybody. So there's not much excuse left for people to not, take things into positivity and take it to the next level.
Yeah.
Is there a danger that making building too easy creates a generation of builders who don't actually understand what they're building? And if yes, how to overcome it?
So, big picture, I'm optimistic, right? Like, I think the way you learn to understand what you're building is you build it, you see what problems there are, and you deal with it. Like, when I started Bubble, I was a fairly experienced programmer, but Bubble was by far the most ambitious thing I'd ever done. And I made a ton of mistakes. And, I realized I had built myself into a corner at one point. Like, one of our customers' websites kept on like crashing. I had no idea how to fix it. And guess what? I got a very quick education in how it worked behind the hood and how to maintain systems at scale. So I am net optimistic, but I think there is a real danger there. And the danger is that that learning process can be pretty brutal if you go in without the proper support. And that's actually something Bubble is very focused on right now, right? Like we're looking at sort of the rise of vibe coding and asking ourselves, okay, a lot of people are getting the opportunity to create software. What happens to them 3 months from now when their customers ask them to add 5 new features, something breaks, and there's an actual issue in production, and AI gets stuck and it fixes it, but actually breaks something else, and they start like finding themselves like unable to understand the system they've built. So what we've been working on is trying to build transparency, essentially, right? Like an AI coding system that doesn't just build it for you, but also teaches you about what it's built, lets you see what it's built in human understandable language instead of computer language, so that you're not helpless and not just like wondering what this pile of opaque code is. So I do think there's real danger there. I think better tooling can help make that like, intersection with reality moment a lot smoother and a lot less, fraught if the platform does its job.
Bubble is at a very sweet spot of, when we talk about these low code, no code, all the way to the vibe coding on the whole spectrum. So Bubble is somewhere in the middle, I would say. It's right at the very sweet spot. So it's for the people who are really focused on building complex web applications, something like a SaaS marketplace or a social network or internal CRM sort of tool. So that is where they definitely need to rely on something that's as heavy duty as Bubble and still offers you the low code as well as some AI generated prompt driven coding experience. Do we want to add anything into it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. What I'd add is like we're really focused on that like long-term ownership journey with the software, right? So if you're building a prototype, I wouldn't particularly pitch Bubble to you because I think vibe coding is great for producing a prototype. We come in when you need to live with the software and when there's real consequences if there's issues with the software. That's our focus.
What's the biggest mistakes non-technical founders are going to make over the next 5 years?
We're already kind of seeing this all over LinkedIn, and it's security, right? Like security is the number one thing that bites founders going down the vibe coding path. And I think at this point people know that's a risk. I mean, there's still stories about people like, "Oh, wow, what just happened?" But I think most people are starting to become aware that it's something that they have to deal with, but I don't think they know what to do about it, right? Because you can ask I actually saw this exchange on LinkedIn where this guy posted, my app got hacked, someone stole my Stripe API key, I lost, $50,000. What I should have done is I should have asked the AI I should have told the AI, please make it secure. And like his comments exploded and people were like, really? I'm not sure you learned your lesson here, right? Like, just asking for it to be secure isn't always enough.
If you have to share a brutal truth on the same lines, if someone builds a startup entirely using vibe coding tools today, what determines whether it actually survives next few years?
I think the honest answer is it has to be valuable enough and important enough to the creator that they're willing to go through the pain that they're going to experience, right? Because there's paths through it, right? If you are successful enough, you can hire an engineer to come in and help fix your code base, right? Or, you can learn the hard way and dig in yourself and use AI to educate you and pick up coding skills and dive in. It's all super labor intensive. It's all about rolling up your sleeves and, it's only going to happen if you care enough about what you're building and if what you're building is valuable enough. Again, with Bubble, we're trying to make that learning curve less painful. That's our mission. We still see, right, like the people who succeed on Bubble are the ones who are the most motivated and who are building the thing that's most important to them, because in any act of entrepreneurship, there's always going to be struggle and effort. We just want to make that as minimal as possible, given what is possible.
You mentioned earlier building a tech industry built on trust. Mind sharing more insights on what's actually currently broken about the trust in tech?
Yeah, great question. So I started Bubble back in 2012. And back then it was kind of a meme that startup founders were like, I want to change the world. It got parodied. I think the TV show Silicon Valley did like this whole like montage about it,
Yeah.
right? And it became a joke, and an increasingly sour joke over time, because what was pretty obvious to people as they sort of watched how this played out is that I think there was a lot of genuine idealism feeding into this, but that idealism got warped by money, and the larger tech firms ended up going down a direction where they were making decisions not based on changing the world positively, but like, trying to please investors and hit their bottom lines and give big bonuses and, very, 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 very commercial, right? So people's opinion of tech, right? Like the general American public, doesn't love big tech, right? Like, so I think tech has lost its credibility to say, we want to change the world, right? When Sam Altman comes out and says, like, we're going to change the world, people are like, oh, please don't, right? like stop. No, right? We absolutely don't want that to happen. So I think if we're going to get out of that hole, right, it actually starts small, right? Like, I don't think big idealistic visions are what is needed right now because I don't think people are going to trust them or believe in them. And I think even like the employees of such a company are going to have some doubts. I think what's actually needed is kind of return to the fundamentals of goodness and trust, which is, being honest with others, taking pride in your work, thinking through the consequences of your actions, not the kind of thing that like someone would say on stage at a tech conference, but the kind of thing that like a blacksmith 200 years ago would think about as they're like, am I making this horseshoe up to my standards, right? And I think that attitude needs to be reinfused into tech because if you build that foundation, then you can start having more idealistic visions built sort of on top of like that foundation of trust.
Yeah, and that trust comes from the transparency.
Yep. Transparency, I think, is a huge part of that. But also when someone looks inside that transparency, they have to see something that's good, right?
Yes. As AI becomes more complex and harder to see, how should a normal person decide what to trust and what not to trust?
Yeah. So I think Anthropic did something very cool here. I don't know how many people listen to this know about this, but they released the Constitution for Claude. It's this very long document that kind of like lays out systematically how they want Claude to interact in the world as like a helpful agent. And it's actually a really serious document. They got some philosophy majors, proud of my field, to like contribute to it. They're very thoughtful and it really reads well. Like you read that document and you're like, wow, yeah, like I would trust this. So I think the fact that they made the Constitution for Claude public is incredibly important, and it has frankly boosted my trust in Anthropic as a company. And what I would love to see is that to go through the whole ecosystem. I want the other model providers to be sharing their constitutions. I want people building on top of base models to be sharing how they're training their models and agents. I think that's sort of the long-term ingredient for trust.
And we're talking about trust and transparency. So my next question is about responsibility.
Mhm.
In today's world, who carries the greatest moral responsibility? Is it the founders? Is it the builders? Or someone else entirely? And what does that responsibility actually look like in practice, not in only theory?
One thing I learned as like a leader that really stuck with me, I think I got this from a YouTube video, I forget which one, but it really resonated based on like my own experience running companies, is that everyone in a situation should take 100% responsibility, right? Which sounds paradoxical because if like I take 100% and you take 100%, does that mean it's 200%? Right? But actually the way it works is if there's something going wrong and I take full responsibility for it and I'm not like, well, it's partly your fault, and you take full responsibility for it and you say, well, you're not like, oh, it's Josh's fault, right? We're able to work together to make it better. So I don't view the whose responsibility is it as the right question. I think the answer is yes. Like we are responsible for building and for creating. And what I think it looks like in practice, to the other part of your question, right, is that you don't walk away from the consequences, right? Like if you break things for a user of your product or a customer or whatever, you make it right. You stick through it, you figure it out, you push forward, and you stick around, right? Trust and responsibility comes from repeated interactions. It comes from someone who's not like out to like do a transaction and move on, right? So that I think
Learn
is
from it.
learn from it, exactly.
And since you touched about the leadership, and my next set of questions are, I think it's going to benefit anybody, not just people who are building in the tech today. So my first question is, how do you know when to trust your intuition
Mhm,
versus when to question it.
mhm.
And every leader struggles with it.
Yeah. Yeah. So my theory is there's like two kinds of people. I think some people are very natural and intuitive and spontaneous, and they're great at going with their gut. And sometimes they need to rein it back in and like apply some critical thinking. And then there's other people who are great at the critical thinking and analyze everything and reason through every decision, and gives them a lot of strength, and they avoid you know a lot of bad choices, but they don't always listen to their guts, right? So my guess is, as I say that, everyone listening already knows who they are. I'm definitely, rational overthinker side of things, and I've talked myself into bad decisions before. And had I listened to my gut, I probably would have made better decisions. I've sometimes made the error on the other side where I was like too spontaneous and I should have like listened and thought more, but it's much more for me erring on the side of overthinking. And I think for every leader, right, you have to know yourself. You have to know which direction you're going to make a mistake in. And then for little decisions, don't question yourself, right? Like part of being a leader is like not getting overwhelmed by the hundreds of decisions you have to make every day. But when a decision is consequential, flip to your other side and make sure the part of you, because there's always a part of you, like even if you're a spontaneous person, you have a little voice in your head. And even if you're like a thinker, you have a little spontaneous gut in your head, right? Make sure that part of you is heard before you make the decision, if that decision carries real consequences.
Can I ask a personal question?
Yeah.
So, what's a fear you've had to outgrow in order to become who you are today?
I'm kind of a control
I know
freak.
it's personal.
Yeah. So I'm kind of control freak. Like I like to be in charge of situations, and that makes me uncomfortable when like things feel big and open-ended and like uncontrollable, right? And that's a real issue with entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is all about like stepping out into the unknown and putting something out there and losing control of the situation a little bit. And I've gotten a lot more comfortable with relaxing and giving up control over time, but I I still, clench up a little bit when I'm in a situation where I don't feel in control. And the more the more I've been able to get over that fear, the more effective I've been as an entrepreneur.
No, that's quite right. Being a leader, you have to really make certain decisions that make you feel bad, but you have to make those decisions anyway. So, like Bob Iger, one of my favorite CEOs, he said that you have to. At certain times, you have to stand alone in loneliness with
Mhm.
your conviction alone.
Yeah.
So the time or future decides that you are right, but you have to take those decisions. So and certain level of control is necessary as long as it's pushing things towards the positive direction. What's something you've had to sacrifice to get to where you are, and was it worth it?
I have become a lot more focused and narrow a person because of Bubble. Like in my early 20s, I was a dreamer. I read lots of disparate stuff. I was very pretty creative, I think. And I still have some of those parts of my personality, but like I kind of feel like the process of building Bubble kind of squeezed me through a tube a little bit, kind of like toothpaste. And I lost a little bit of impromptu open curiosity and started filtering things a little bit more through the lens of like, okay, but is this effective? Does this move the ball forward? Right? And I'm I miss that a little bit, right? I've had regrets about that aspect of it, because it is a real loss of part of who I am. I've tried to like recultivate it a little bit, but it's when you take a path in life, right? Like you have to live the consequences of that path. I mean, I would say it's worth it in the sense that I wouldn't want to like roll back the clock and do my life differently. Like I'm happy with where I am. I'm happy with who I've become. I'm happy with my family. I'm happy with Bubble and the impact it's had on the world, right? So I'm not gonna erase history, but I also do miss some of the like doors I've closed a little bit.
Yeah, that's why they always say, like, always plan your future, but write it with the pencil. It's just separate that in my case, that pencil is really bad because it self erases itself every so often.
Mhm.
If you could go back to the beginning of Bubble, what would you do differently? Not strategically, but philosophically.
Strategically is an easier question to answer. There's a lot I would do different strategically, just especially on the technology side of things, because I was really learning as I went. But philosophically, I think the biggest decision I would take another look at philosophically would be building it as open source, which was always something I kind of had in the back of my mind and decided against it because in many ways it's a lot easier to build a closed source platform as a service company than it is to build an open source company. And I don't even know if it would have worked open source. Like a lot of open source companies have really struggled over the last 10 years. But the reason it like lingers with me is like given what Bubble is and what it's trying to do, the sort of open source ethos, I think, would have helped boost us in certain ways. So I've always been a little curious about like where it would have landed had we picked that path. And we might do more open source stuff in the future, but going from like a platform built to be run by us to a platform built to be run by users is a huge change. So it's one of those decisions that is kind of like path defining a little bit.
I'm just curious to learn if you strip away the titles and success and those external validation, what actually makes your life feel meaningful?
Yeah, I mean, my family, um, the positive impact Bubble has had, like, when I hear from someone that it, like, changed their career or shifted them in a different direction, like, I meet people on a fairly regular basis who talk to me about, like, how Bubble nudged them down a path that they wouldn't have been able to go down otherwise, like, that's pretty meaningful to me, and then, I find it meaningful just to this is gonna sound stupid, but to be alive, right? Like it's such a privilege to like be able to walk around the world, take in you know, how beautiful nature is, how great other people are, right? Like it's kind of it almost doesn't need justification at some point.
What does an AI native org look like at steady state?
I actually think it's a very interesting question because I think companies are going to change a lot, actually. I have some working hypotheses here, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm speculating that companies are going to be less defined by their product and more defined by their process. And what I mean by that is that products are going to cycle much faster as software development speeds up. It's not going to be like, here's the product and then it lasts for 10 years. It's going to be like every year or so, like the industry evolves a little bit and the product changes and shifts. So what keeps a company is less, like, hey, we're Slack. We've built this whole organization around Slack, the product, but more, hey, we're this collection of people who are really good at innovating, who care about this category of user, who are looking to solve their problems, and who are always disrupting themselves, releasing new software, trying new things. It becomes like much more of a living organism. So that's what I think Stay State looks like.
So, how do you look at it when people look back at this era 50 years from now? What do you hope Bubble contributed to the humanity?
Yeah. Well, I would love to, know that the top 100 companies created over the last 50 years were built on Bubble. That's the most straight line contribution. But I also want to think about like, everyone's life it touches. What do people who worked at Bubble for 3 years and then what do they go on to do? And we've had a number of employees who've quit Bubble to start their own companies, right? Like, were we able to push them in a positive direction? What do they contribute to the world, right? So I think it's like ripple effects.
Got it. And now a couple of closing questions. If the future is being written by AI, what part of that story do you still want humans to author?
Yeah. I think humans need to co-write the future regardless, but I think the place humans really come in, right? Like AI is great at the how, humans are great at the what and why. And I think as AI gets better, we might have to back off from the how a little bit, but the what and why is going to become even more important as the how gets easier. So that's where I want to see humans take authorship.
This is more like your message to the young generation, to the future builders, and to anybody, any common person. Is learning to code becoming irrelevant or more important than ever?
Learning to code will become irrelevant, but the cognitive skills around systems thinking and analysis and critical thinking are going to become more important.
Are we heading towards a world where ideas matter more than execution?
I think ideas and execution can't be separated, because an idea as like one sentence isn't an idea. An idea is a whole vision for how it's brought into being.
Will the next billion-dollar founders even know how to code?
Probably not. Probably not.
How soon is that going to happen?
I think the technological preconditions for that are already here. I think the gap is really diffusion of that technology and knowledge, which I think is going to play out over the next couple of years.
And my last question to you now, is the Silicon Valley overestimating AI or underestimating it?
I think it's still underestimating.
I agree.
I think some people are overestimating, right? But I think on average, people are still afraid of AI, like we were talking about, right? And I think because of that, they're like artificially compressing, their predictions about what it will do. So I actually think they're underestimating.
Josh, I am so thankful to you. It was such a great conversation with you. We are really at crunch for the time, but I really appreciate your time and I hope to have you again soon.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.